Hello, everybody. My name is Adam Thorne, and welcome to the Australian Aviation Podcast. Before we get into it, I will introduce my co-host, Chris Fenton. Welcome to the show.
Good afternoon.
And Jake Nelson. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Adam. Before
we steam into the news, I have spotted out of the corner of my eye an addition to the fleet. It looks like an Alliance. I don't think we've seen that particular Alliance aircraft before, Chris.
No, it's new to the collection, new to the podcast studio. So it came care of our friends at Alliance. So
this is
shout
nice.
out to Alliance. Thanks for sending that down. So it's one of their Fokkers, and it's
excuse me,
Fokkers.
That's a real low rent joke
with an
O.
O. With an O.
Wasn't that a Ben Stiller movie?
Yeah,
something like that. So yeah.
Well, no, we want more. Well, no, tell me a bit more about this because it's we need to. There's people watching on our. We've got video now.
We do have video now. So it's one of their celebrating centenary of flights. So along the side of it, it's got Wyndham, Australia to London, England. So celebrating 100 years of aviation from memory.
That's pretty good. Well, Thank you for for sending us one of the planes in. If you're listening from another major airline, and you should be, and I imagine they all are, we want more.
We
the
do
fleet
want more.
Can continue to grow.
Yeah. Looking for a Bonza one. We need a
Have
Bonza.
They not
we
sent,
do need a
no,
Bonza
they've
one.
not sent one yet. Yeah,
not
come
very
on,
good, is
Bonza.
it?
Do they have any yet? I mean, they are pretty new. They might not have any yet.
Well, you'd like to think that now is the time to invest. That's
Now's
a good
true.
the time
PR
to
That's
move.
true.
invest. So
Yeah.
send us one. We'll proudly display it in the studio for the podcast.
And hey, speaking of Australia and England, so glad, Chris, that our weather machine worked over in Manchester there.
I mean,
Very
don't
true.
get me started.
Very true.
I mean, it's not a cricket show, but firstly, the English were cheated by the cheating Australians, and now we've been cheated by poor rules around the weather. So essentially, what we've learned is us English are always cheated.
Well,
by.
it's funny because no one in England was complaining when the poor weather helped them retain the Ashes back in 2013.
I don't know what you're talking about.
And didn't old mate do the same thing a couple of years ago with the whole stumping thing, which is controversy? The guy that got...
I don't know what anyone's talking about. Like,
Yeah,
basically,
he did the same thing a few years ago, I'm sure.
we all have different views, and I respect all opinions. But let's just agree that Australia is a nation of cheats. They cheat at sport, and this whole thing's a disaster. Just move on.
Yet you still live
I
here.
have to say, the British community right now has kind of accomplished the impossible by making me feel patriotic about cricket. That's an achievement in itself.
I mean, I'm not. The problem I've got, right, so behind the scenes, I work in an office which, as you can imagine, it tends to be full of Australian people.
Why?
And I don't know. I don't agree with it either. But the amount of abuse I have to take. Now, I'm trying to fight the good fight on my own, but it's difficult. It's everyone versus me. But obviously I know morally I'm correct because I've not the whole office, obviously they're a bunch of cheaters, so I know that
It's now a good time to admit I do not follow the cricket, and I loathe the cricket, and I would rather go and paint the house 10 times over.
But even though, and this is the shameful thing, even though you hate the cricket, you're still, as a kind of a natural born urge that all Australian people have, you want to use that to go in on me. That's what I'm
Not
up
at
against.
all.
Even
You are the man, the myth, the legend that is. You are my friend.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a natural instinct for all Australians to just, stick the boot into the palms whenever we can for any reason.
When I grew
It's
up,
our birthright.
No, but when I grew up, we obviously saw the Australians correctly as the bad guys. We saw them in cricket as the bad guys. And then when I came over to here, bizarrely, you lot view the English as the bad guys. And I'm like, why would you do that?
Well, look,
but apparently there is all sorts of reasons why.
Well, Adam, if you didn't want us to constantly be ragging on you shouldn't have sent all the people you didn't like over here.
Well, I mean, it turned out all right for you lot in the end. Anyway, we will move on from that before it all gets controversial. And we'll talk about something even more controversial, which is airport slots. and the ongoing furor over something that on the surface seems quite boring, but actually is quite interesting and has big ramifications. I will do a quick recap. You know, when you get those TV shows and it's like, last episode.
Previously on the Australian Aviation Podcast.
Exactly. That was very good. So let's talk through airport slots. So a slot is a literal takeoff slot. And obviously you can only have so many aircraft on a runway taking off at one time. So these things are quite precious. As you would imagine, some slots are better than others. So you want to have the peak times. The system that we have in Australia and in many countries around the world for working out who gets those slots, it basically is that if you have a slot, you can keep it forever as long as you fly it 80% of the time. Now, the reason for that is basically to encourage competition, but also to give airlines a little bit of leeway if they need to cancel a flight for a legitimate reason. However, the problem with this is it allows them to cancel up to 1/5 of their flights and still keep this monopoly on the best times forever. Now, this is a problem kind of globally, but it's particularly a problem in Sydney, where obviously we at the moment have just one airport for this huge city, in fact, one big airport for the whole state. And we have this new situation where we've got two new players in Bonza and Rex trying to take on Virgin and Qantas, and they are now struggling to get hold of these plum positions. Now, this also coincides with our kind of post-COVID recovery. What we are seeing in a kind of flip of this time last year is that while the international aviation is kind of actually recovering pretty well and much better than we expected from COVID, domestic aviation is stagnating. So we're at kind of 90%, 92, 93% of those 2019 figures, and we're struggling to get back to where we are before. And so a lot of people are basically saying these slot rules are hampering our recovery. That was a long prelude before we get to the story. But essentially, Sydney Airport have seen little growth in the last month. And Sydney Airport CEO has said, to quote the headline Jake wrote, "Use your slots or give them up."
Yeah.
Jake, tell us more.
Yeah, this is probably Jeff Colbert, the outgoing CEO of Sydney Airport. This is probably his strongest intervention yet. He said that the airlines are largely to blame for the lagging domestic recovery at Sydney. Passenger numbers grew only 1.2% year on year. So that was 1.90 million domestic travellers in June. That is a 90.6% recovery rate on June 2019. Contrast this to a 66.7% year-on-year jump in international traffic. 1.16 million people went through the international terminal at Sydney in June. That's an 88.8% recovery rate on June 2019. It's sort of trending towards the international recovery overtaking the domestic recovery because it's almost caught up. And basically what Jeff Colbert has said is these steep airfares and the high cancellation rates on popular domestic routes are suppressing domestic passenger demand. He says, quote, "In the 12 months to June, passenger numbers on the Sydney to Melbourne route were just 81% recovered compared to pre-pandemic levels, while numbers between Sydney and Canberra were only 64% recovered. It will be interesting to see if this is a long-term trend. If incumbent airlines have decided to fly less between key domestic markets, then they should relinquish slots to domestic and international carriers who want to operate out of Sydney Airport and provide more choice for customers." So that was a direct quote there from Jeff Colbert in a press release.
One of the extraordinary things about this is Sydney actually are not in charge of the rules. This is essentially a kind of a government mandate, but obviously they sort of have to enforce them. Now, both Qantas and Virgin will say very loudly that they're not in any way trying to game the system. And the reason we particularly have issues at Sydney is through what Virgin called the complexities of flying at Sydney. And that is that it's particularly vulnerable to bad weather, that obviously it's kind of full to bursting. But it's quite, and everyone's choosing their words carefully. They're saying there's no issue here. But then you've got Sydney Airport itself turn round and say you need to give your slots up. Like they're saying this isn't good.
Yeah, and it's probably impacting a bit on the situation that Jeff Colbert is retiring. So he may be finally deciding that, hang it all, I'll say what I like. But it is true that Sydney Airport has long been opposed to keeping this current 80-20 slot system. Which has, been pointed out by airlines such as Rex and Bonza, in particular, as being, a real hamper on growth. Ironically, of course, it was John Sharp, the deputy chairman of Rex, who implemented the 80-20 rule when he was in government as a minister. But he has now said that was a mistake. He'd want the ratio to sort of be skewed less in favor of the airlines. And I mean, it does complicate matters as well that Sydney is, not just a domestic airport. It's an international airport. You've got all these. It's Australia's major gateway. It's the main way that international passengers enter the country. And so to have all of these, it is, as you said, Adam, full to bursting. And so all of these prime time slots are in very high demand. There's just not a lot of real estate. And of course, as you said again, these in situations where there's high winds or bad weather of any kind, like we've seen recently, there's been a number of instances in the past few weeks where Sydney Airport has gone down to single runway operations because there have been high winds that have forced one of the runways to close. And when there's only one runway running, flights get cancelled.
It's interesting because I say the big airlines are saying we're not doing anything dodgy at all. This isn't the case. You've got Sydney that are not Sydney Airport that are not accusing anybody necessarily of gaming the system, but they are saying if you can't use these slots, give them up. You've got the ACCC, which is probably the most significant intervention that they said, and they chose their words carefully, and they said the system can be exploited. So they seem to be suggesting that this rule is wrong. One of the things that we had kind of coincidentally happened that it was on Friday last week, BITRA, which is basically the kind of department of the Department of Transport that deals with aviation statistics, released a lot of the information for the kind of the cancellations and the delays that we saw last month. So one of the things I did was to go back 6 months and see how many cancellations we've had on the Sydney to Melbourne and Melbourne to Sydney route, and then to compare that to what we saw last year, and then to compare that to what we saw in 2019. So across those 6 months, we had 2,300 flights between Sydney and Melbourne were cancelled, and that compares to the 1,700 in pre-pandemic 2019. So you've got to imagine that there were probably more flights and more people flying as well. So that's actually quite an enormous increase. Obviously, you would assume that of those 2,000 flights, the majority of people that were booked on them would have been thrown onto the next flight or would somehow have got to their destination. So that leads to the question is, why were these 2,300 flights cancelled? Now, yes, you will have problems with weather and etc. But at the same time, it is extraordinary that on one route in just 6 months, 2,300 flights are cancelled. That is a gobsmacking number. I'll bring you here on this, Chris. What do you think? Because I saw that and I was totting it up and I'm like, that is a lot. It should be the case that a cancellation is a very rare thing. But what this shows us is actually an incredibly common occurrence.
Yeah, look, it's airlines never want to cancel a flight. And speaking from a crew point of view, when I was crew, we don't step on board at the start of the day going, how can we F with the passengers today? I know, let's cancel a flight. The crew
not with that attitude, Chris.
No, not with that attitude at all. So the crew definitely want the aircraft to take off. What would be interesting to note, does the BITRA report break it down to reason of cancellation?
This is one of the interesting things, and if somebody listening can help with this, let me know. What I want to know is if or when a flight is cancelled, does somebody have to record the reason for that? Is there somebody that's responsible? Is that even a thing? At the moment, all we know is a flight gets cancelled. And obviously the complexity of this is sometimes It will be a number of factors that cause something to happen. Sometimes it might be that something happens that leads to something else happening that leads to the flight not taking off. And obviously, as we've spoken about before on the show, it's a kind of a symbiotic relationship. Everything kind of affects everything else. So it's not necessarily the case that somebody would have written down, we couldn't be bothered, we cancelled it. Or,
Planes haunted.
Exactly. So it's not necessarily that easy. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why everyone is choosing their words very carefully when they're making kind of accusations, and also why the big airlines are being quite steadfast in their defence. Yeah. But nonetheless, I find that figure gobsmacking.
Yeah, look, the figure is huge, and I would have a safe guess, safety first priority, of course. If it's not safe to operate the flight, don't go ahead. There would certainly be, given the recent delays that we've seen out of Sydney with the weather and the wind, there would be some delays attributed to weather. I would hate to think that flights were cancelled because they didn't have enough passengers or bums on seats. It has happened in the past that airlines have been known to cancel a flight because there's not enough passengers, so it's easier to fill up one flight than operate two half-empty flights. But
the cancellation rate for the last month between Sydney and Melbourne is 8.9%. That's enormous.
That's huge.
That is huge. And that compares to the kind of long-term nationwide underlying number of 2.1%. The idea that almost 1 in 10 flights are getting cancelled seems to me an extraordinary blowout.
Yeah, look, I think if you ask the airlines, the big players, they will put it down to staffing issues right now. That seems to be the go-to reason for most things at the moment. Oh, we don't have enough staff. But look, I think it's not acceptable. Australia deserves better. Our travelling public deserve better. We've had better. And if everyone's skirting around the issue, there's clearly an issue. So I'd like to know who's putting their hand up to be the first one to say, let's change it.
Now, thinking about it, I think of all the reasons that your flight could be cancelled, I think planes haunted would probably be the best. I wouldn't mind.
But if a plane was haunted, wouldn't that mean that somebody would have had to have died on that plane?
Not necessarily. Could have been a wandering ghost who just decided to take up residence on the plane. Could happen.
There is a very old story of, and I totally digress here. There's an old story of an aircraft that unfortunately went down in the US many, many years ago. I believe it was the 70s or the 80s. Some of the parts of that aircraft were usable. So things like galley carts and Atlas boxes where they're in the crew galley and they store things that the crew may need. So the parts that were deemed safe to be reused were cleaned up and reused on another aircraft.
I don't believe that. No, I don't believe this. No.
Now, the crew of the aircraft that these particular parts went onto said that the aircraft became haunted and they felt the presence of the captain, who unfortunately was lost in the original plane crash.
I just find it very hard to believe that there's a plane crash. Presumably, people had died, and then the air traffic investigators are what are going through that very emotional scenes, and they're like, oh, that cart, that drinks cart, like that works perfully fine. Let's keep that.
Money to an airline.
Bing boom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Avenge me!
Okay, welcome back. So we talked there a little bit about the problem with slots.
Plane haunting.
Plane hauntings as well, and slots, and how that was tying into the kind of stagnating domestic recovery. We had another kind of big storyline almost in aviation over the last few months has been as to whether or not Air Services, which is the organisation that oversees air traffic control, whether or not they have a staff shortage problem. What Air Services say, and I'm being a bit flippant here, is we don't have a staff shortage problem. In fact, what we have is a staff shortage problem. Or to be less flippant, what they're saying is we do not have a kind of underlying lack of staff. In fact, we have 100 staff more than we need to run the network. The reason that we're having issues is because I think they use the words like short-term and unplanned leave of air traffic controllers. So this is like people calling in sick. The counter argument to this is that if you had more staff in the first place, you would be able to cover these things. So all you've done is cannily just change the number of what you say is the minimum you need. Now, what this has led to is periods where the airspace, large swathes of the airspace have been effectively shut down. And so what that means is that rather than the person in air traffic control tower talking to the aircrafts and kind of guiding them in, the aircraft self-separate, which basically means they talk to themselves. Some people say that this is a perfectly safe thing to do. Some people say it's not. But whatever your views, it will lead obviously to delays because obviously it's a bit more of a long-winded process. Now, you had Qantas come out at the end of last week basically and said one of the reasons why they've had significantly more delays last month was because of what they called staff shortages at Air Services Australia. Jake, tell us a little bit more about this. It feels quite significant that Qantas have actually used this turn of phrase and pointed this out.
Yeah, we had BITRA data from the Department of Transport that showed Qantas planes took off on time just 71% of the time in June. That's down from 75% in May and 77% in April. It has to be said there was poor performance across the board. So Qantas was still the top performing airline when you include QantasLink in there. But a Qantas statement said this performance was below Qantas's own target of above 80%, chiefly due to bad weather at major airports on 19 out of 30 days. We, of course, had those horror wind days at Sydney Airport. But Qantas also said, quote, Air Services Australia's staffing shortages also had a significant impact on on-time performance in June. So Qantas is basically, I mean, everyone in their cat is now saying that Air Services has a staffing problem. We've had Civil Air, we've had the Australian Federation of Air Pilots. We've had all these people coming out, and now Qantas, the flying kangaroo itself, is coming out and saying there are staff shortages at Air Services. It is affecting reliability.
One of the things that's interesting is that particularly the unions, one of their arguments is, why don't you just say you've got a staff shortage problem? That's their argument, because at the moment they feel that Air Services are being quite coy and quite clever with their language, and they would say, why not do that? Their accusation is that the reason they have a staff shortage problem is that they effectively let too many people go during COVID, particularly with kind of early retirement or redundancy schemes, and they've now been spat out at the other end in a position where they can't cope.
Yeah, that's sort of a common theme that we hear, from. We had the other week a story where we had comments from pilots, we had comments from air traffic controllers. A lot of these air traffic controllers, they've gone to the ATSB because the ATSB sort of have been doing a probe of this, or they've been. The ATSB has published some REPCON data, and these air traffic controllers are saying this retirement incentive scheme that Air Services has brought in has caused too many air traffic controllers to leave, and now there are not enough air traffic controllers. And of course, ATCs take a long time to train up.
Moving on from that, on a similar note, Jetstar itself has had a lot of problems with reliability. So for many months, they were the worst for delays and for cancellations.
And I hear England has a lot of trouble with rain.
Well, that is just shocking, isn't it? We've moved on from that. You had your time. You had your shine. What you've done there...
It's sort of a redundant statement, isn't it, Adam?
What you've done there is, it's one, it feels like that's against the rules of the show. But secondly, it's not within the spirit of the show, which is against something that Australians do struggle to understand. We're going to move on quickly from that ambush. Don't you even think about it.
I'm just pointing out, Adam, that it's rather an obvious statement. Jetstar has problems with reliability. England has problems with rain.
I think that's
New South Wales has problems with state of origin.
It's a very tenuous link. Unfortunately, though, the England team will not be hiring 140 new pilots this year, but Jetstar will be. See what I did there? That's a spin bowl to you. Go on. Tell us
I
a bit
don't
more.
think pilots would really be helpful for the English cricket team.
I don't know. They might be good.
They want to be hiring cricketers, surely. I don't know if a pilot... I wouldn't want a pilot trying to play cricket on my national team, and by contrast, I wouldn't want a cricketer trying to fly my plane. Probably less so the latter, actually. Anyway, Jetstar is looking to hire more than 140 new pilots this year. It's a big recruitment drive. It says it's one of its biggest ever pilot intakes. Now, this is going to support its push to improve its reliability because Jetstar, had said it's working on that. And it also, they're going to support new routes such as Sydney to Rarotonga, Brisbane to Seoul, Melbourne to Fiji. This is part of a broader plan within the Qantas Group to bring in 8,500 new operational roles over the next 10 years. And this is, as this ongoing talent shortage continues to hit the industry. So Jetstar's chief pilot and head of flight operations, Captain Jeremy Schmidt, says, it's fantastic to see so many new team members coming on board this year. They've got their ninth A321neo LR about to arrive. They're expecting 9 more before the end of 2024. They need more pilots, says Captain Schmidt, to support the growing fleet and the network. And this, of course, follows a couple of months ago. There was a larger hiring blitz for Jetstar cabin crew. They're looking to employ up to an additional 700 cabin staff by the end of the year.
But the argument with this is, as with the ongoing issue, is the reason they're having to hire so many people now, similar to what we said with other services, is that too many people left during the pandemic, and wasn't the entire point of our JobKeeper money to stop this very situation occurring, Chris?
Yeah, look, JobKeeper was intended to keep people in jobs. And for a lot of crew that was stood down, and I know several friends who were stood down from a flying role during COVID, who found a suitable ground job that, whilst wasn't paying the best, allowed them to be at home nightly with their families, enjoy weekends again, and have somewhat of a normal, decent social and family life. COVID leaves, airlines come back, they're questioning, do I go back to flying or do I stay in a role that I'm now comfortable and happy in, where I have a social life, I can enjoy time with my family and my friends, and I'm not doing weird hours and shift work anymore. And some people chose to not return for that very reason. Some people were lucky enough to get a really good paying job on the ground.
One of the things I found quite interesting is during those dark days of COVID, sort of in the lockdowns, there was a lot of chat of would people ever want to fly again, or would the numbers be significantly less because of that point in time when everybody thought Zoom was brilliant before we all realised it's just rubbish and awful. It's just terrible. Back when everyone was loving it, they thought, you know what, we'll never leave our homes again. We'll just do everything over Zoom. And so the thinking was that we get spat out post-pandemic and we'd be in a world where people just wouldn't want to fly. They wouldn't feel the need to do it. It would purely be something for holidays, etc. Whereas now what we've found is actually the demand is there. People got bored of Zoom. They soon want to go back to socialising and going on holiday, doing business trips. But you still want to kind of shake somebody's hand and look them in the eye before you sign that big contract. So in that sense, those people were proved spectacularly wrong. What has hurt the industry, ironically, is a lot of people leaving the industry thinking that it wouldn't go back to normal.
Well, it'd be hard to have a holiday over Zoom, wouldn't it, Adam?
Well, well, actually what they were doing during COVID, people were watching sort of videos of flights, videos of long train journeys and stuff. So it's not, not the same, is it?
Well, yeah, that is a good point. And if you listen to the podcast we did a month or two ago with Jeb Brooks, he's an aviation YouTuber. He was talking about the difficulties of maintaining a channel during the pandemic. Because he primarily did aviation, but he decided, with the flights not going anymore, he decided to pivot to trains during the pandemic, and that became wildly successful. So he said some of his train videos were even more popular than his flight videos.
Why are you saying that on this podcast? That is not on brand.
Sacrilege.
That is not on brand at all.
But one of the other things he said was that, yes, there are a lot of YouTubers out there, aviation YouTubers, who their whole thing is that they just get on a plane and they just film the flight from beginning to end. You can go and you can look at this entire, 1, 2, 3, however many hour flight just from beginning to end on YouTube, and you can sit there and watch as the plane does its thing. There's aviation YouTubers out there as well who I know there's at least one that like flies on sort of unusual airlines. Like I saw they did a flight on there was a flight on Air Koryo to North Korea, and flying on sort of old sort of Russian planes. There's another YouTuber I saw who did a flight on an old, like a 40-year-old 767. 40-year-old 767 with Eastern Airlines, which is a U.S. carrier that flies exactly once a month between Miami and Santo Domingo, I think, in the Dominican Republic. So if you like aviation YouTube, there's a whole world of it out there for you. What were we talking about?
Okay, welcome back. Now, before we wrap up, we are mere weeks away from the Australian Aviation Awards. Tickets are selling like hotcakes. Can you give us an update on where we are with the awards? What do people need to do if they want to come along?
Visit the Australian Aviation Awards website to purchase tickets or give Lizzie a call. Tickets are on sale now. They are selling like hotcakes. Jake, Adam and I will be in the room on the night.
You say that like it's a selling point. Yeah.
It's a massive selling point. If you want to meet the team, you've got to be in the room on the night to meet the A team.
The AA team.
Well, has anyone else sent in a name suggestion yet?
Have we had any more?
I haven't seen any more. If you're out there, we are still looking for names for the
AAA.
The AAAs.
I like the AAAs.
The AAAs are pretty cool.
I still like my suggestion, the Flyleys. Like the Walkleys.
I wasn't a fan of that. Sorry,
No,
it's too similar to Flyby, to Flybys and stuff like that.
We're not a loyalty scheme.
No, we're not.
No.
We should have a loyalty scheme.
However, back on track.
Yeah.
Back on track. Good game's a quick game. The tickets are selling really well. The night is shaping up to be a fantastic night. All of the finalists are now at judging stage and judging criteria for our judges getting prepared to crown and announce some amazing and deserving winners on the night.
Well, thanks for that update. I think that is probably just about all we've got time for this week. Have I missed anything?
I've got a shout out to give, but I'll wait until you.
No. Let's do the shout out now before we wrap up the show. Who's your fan?
So no, it's not a fan. It's an old friend that I used to work with who sent me a message earlier in the week saying, "Hey, stumbled across the Aviation podcast. Love what you and the team do. Good job. Keep it up." So shout out to Nathan in Sydney. Thanks for the message, mate. Thanks for listening and joining in. We hope you enjoy the podcast moving forward, or the video cast now.
Vodcast.
Vodcast. Is that what it's called? Vodcast. So yeah, thanks for listening and tuning in.
Speaking just on the Australian Aviation Awards, of course, speaking of deserving winners, I do believe that Australian Aviation is tipped to retain the award this year as opposed to English Aviation due to weather concerns.
These are so tenuous, and they're just no, you won't let it go, and it's not very nice, really. It's just not very nice.
It's not cricket.
It's all right. You can have that one. Yes, it's just not cricket. But who watches cricket when you can watch the Women's World Cup, which I've heard is effectively coming home to England? We are the European champions. We will be the favourites for this. So for me, that's the sport that I'm interested in. Cricket's just a horrible old fuddy-duddy thing it's just terrible. So I've moved on. So next week, we'll be talking about the Women's World Cup.
Moving the goalposts, so to speak,
Yes,
Adam.
you can have that one. That was quite good as well.
Take a drink. Remember the pun game. Every time he drops a pun, take a drink.
There's a lot. If someone, I know one of our listeners will be totting these up. There'll be like a master spreadsheet. If you are keeping track and you got any statistics for us, do send them in.
Listen, with how convoluted my puns get, I'd be surprised if it's an orderly spreadsheet, not like a giant conspiracy wall with like bits of yarn connecting various pins in the board.
100%. I do not want to go into your home and see what is going on in there. I mean, it would be a terrible sight. I'm sure it would be like everything on the wall connected together for like a hit list of victims. I don't even want to know.
Who told you about my hit list, Adam?
Are we on it?
I hope not. I need a security allowance. We need people.
Well, you weren't.
On that note, we are going to quickly wrap that up. Jake, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Adam.
And Chris, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And we will, God willing, be here and alive next week. But for now, from us, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
See ya.